Hello, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe my channel first and share my videos. Thank you. Today we wanna look inside in the hearing of the six COEs in front of the Congress. Let's start what they said here.
I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry,
Well, thank you,
who is
Mr.
the ranking member of the committee. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Brooks, let's step back from digital assets and blockchain for a moment. Let's talk about where the internet was, where it's come to, where it's going, right? We're trying to level set here for policymakers. So originally, the internet was a read-only format, in essence. We're consuming information. And then there's additional layers that we place on. It became much more interactive. But counterintuitively, much more interactive, but much more centralized in Web 1, Web 2. What we're hearing now is Web 3. Policymakers need to understand the nature of Web 3. This is a hearing about a component of Web 3. Now, along those lines, what are the characteristics that defined Web 1 and Web 2?
Mr. McHenry, thank you very much for that question. I think that's critical to understanding what we're all trying to build here. So the characteristic of Web 1, if people remember their original AOL account, was an ability to look in a curated walled garden at a set of content that was not interactive but was presented to you on AOL the way that Time magazine used to show you the articles they wanted you to see inside of their magazine. Just you could see it on a screen. The innovation of Web 2 was that suddenly you could not only read content, but you could also write content. This is when the blogosphere became a big thing. People remember this from the late 90s, the early 2000s. The reason for the centralization of the internet, of course, was that all of that activity was being monetized by a very small number of companies.
Very important.
Facebook, as the chairwoman mentions, Google, and two.
He means that the control of this internet was in the hand of big companies, yeah, Facebook and Google.
Or three other companies. What makes Web 3 different is the ability to own the actual network. And that's what crypto assets themselves.
Yes, own the network, and this is the value of these crypto assets. Yeah, that if you own the crypto assets, then you own a part of the network.
Represent is an ownership stake in an underlying network. So when you hear people talk about, for example, layer 1 tokens, what they mean is this is your reward for providing the ledger maintenance services, the computing power to the network that on Web 1 and 2 was done by Google, right? So now people in my hometown of Pueblo, Colorado can actually own the Ethereum network, but they can't own the internet. That's owned by Google and a few other companies. That's what the project of crypto is all about, is allowing people to directly own the networks that have native assets that are supporting it, and that's the nature of decentralization, where the token holders are the people who control the asset,
Okay,
not
so the
Google.
token holders, for our language here on the Hill, those are digital assets, right? Which are the keys to open up the ledger for you to participate, right?
Correct.
So describe to us how those digital assets fit into this internet revolution, Web 3.
So the concept is that you have sort of application layer tokens and you have protocol layer tokens. So if I'm an owner of Bitcoin, let's say that I'm a miner of Bitcoin, somebody who actually creates Bitcoin. The Bitcoin is the reward I receive for doing the work to keep the network operational, and that allows me to own a piece of the Bitcoin blockchain. Or take Ethereum, which is easier to understand. The Ether token represents an ownership stake in the network, but on top of that network are all kinds of apps that get built on the network, much like the apps on your phone depend on the underlying network existing that lets the phone operate. And so people will make judgments about which network is likely to win, and they will invest in the tokens in that network much the same way you might invest in Google stock because you think Google is going to scale access to the original internet. The difference being here, you can vote on what happens in the future of a proof of stake network, for example. You can get rewarded through a proof of work token for maintaining a ledger on something like Bitcoin. But the real message here is that what happens on the decentralized internet is decided by the investors.
Very important point, yeah. And what happens in the network decides the owner of these networks.
Just what happens on the main internet is decided by Twitter, Facebook, Google, and a small number of other companies.
Okay, so getting this layer on digital assets right, for Congress to understand this, everything is built upon that on-ramp to this new internet. So very important for us to be sensitive to how this develops and any actions we take in terms of laws and updating laws to incorporate these new technologies.
Yeah, Mr. McHenry, couldn't agree more, and I think when you hear about all of the problems of different big tech companies, the importance of an owner-controlled network becomes clear.
Okay, owner-controlled network rather than a cooperative, right? And thinking in those terms,
Absolutely.
right?
Very important point, owner-controlled network, and this is the key information that you hear here, that the control goes away from these companies, big companies, and goes to the people.
So if you're not a part of management, you're not making a decision in Web 2. If you are a participant in the network, you're cooperating in the making of those decisions.
Exactly right.
Okay. So I ask this not to be insulting to the panel, but to have a level set here so we have an understanding of what we're talking about. This is not simply about you on this panel. It is about trillions of dollars of assets that did not exist before Satoshi wrote his white paper 13 years ago. It's about $3 trillion in notional value at this stage around the development of a whole new range, a whole new suite of technology that will be developed across the globe, whether or not the United States embraces it and wants to compete, or if it's pushed offshore. So as policymakers, we need to understand what we're talking about here. This is a small panel, important as you may be, a small panel about the discussion about Web 3. And so with that, Madam Chair, thank you for having this hearing, and I hope that we can have more understanding by policymakers about these important concepts. Thank you, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, who is also the chair of the House.
So I go to the next video. It's also important.
So as I shared on the Coinbase platform, we do have KYC, a BSA AML program, and we ensure that we know who our customers are and then have clarity on those transactions. I know other U.S. regulated exchanges that we speak to have similar controls, and everybody on this panel here today, I think, shares those views. There are players who do not follow these, and I think that that is where regulation should be focused, to make sure that there's an expectation on what it is to perform as a digital asset marketplace, and that was part of our policy proposal.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In 2019,
Now, important point regarding the dollar, as the world reserve currency is coming here.
the average daily turnover value of the U.S. dollar constituted 88% of foreign exchange market transactions globally. This dominance by the dollar in global marketplace is a key reason why the dollar remains the reserve currency of the world. Mr. Brooks, welcome back to the committee. It's good to see you again. I think we've actually talked about this subject before in the past. But as digital assets become more common in the global marketplace, with the total digital asset market reaching almost $3 trillion, is ranked.
He said that the market is for cryptocurrency is growing, and I think they get here cold feet because they want that the dollar is the world reserve currency. Now we listen to again.
Member McHenry just said. How do we ensure the U.S. dollar remains the reserve currency?
Well, Mr. Lukemeyer, it's terrific to see you again, and I'd give you a couple of thoughts on that important question. One is, if we start with stable coins before we talk about other crypto assets, I've said for a long time that the secular reduction in dollar holdings as a percentage of global central bank holdings is alarming, and this has been going.
He mentioned that the holding of the dollar is in the world is going to the downside, yeah, and this is alarming. He said, is really the worth of dollar is going to the downside, and I think most of the people realize that the money printing is not good, yeah.
Going on for more than 10 years at this point. So dollars as a share of the European Central Bank, the Japanese Central Bank, et cetera, has shrunk from 80+% to more like 60+%.
From 80 to 60%, the holding of the dollar.
In a short amount of time. What that tells me is that in the future, with the rise of China and other major economies, The U.S.
The rising of China, okay.
dollar can't take its primacy for granted, and we need to start thinking about competing on utility, on features, not just based on a post-World War II monetary system that we could take for granted for the last 2 generations. And that's one of the reasons that I've been such a supporter of internet-enabled dollars, which allow us to compete on features, not only on history. I think
He said, okay, we have an old system, and he prefer to that the dollar is going in direction of the digital dollar. Yeah.
that's really critically important. The second thing I would tell you is, as we enter year 11 or 12 of a highly inflationary environment, after all, we've been printing enormous numbers of new dollars.
That's the key point. Printing of dollar. And the government of US print so much money of the dollar that this dollar losing the value. Yeah. And that's the key point why I think the next generation, yeah, is to adopt this dollar currency in the digital area to avoid some printing.
Since the financial crisis, there will come a time, gradually then suddenly, when the attractiveness of the dollar relative to other currencies could change. One of the benefits of the crypto economy is that it creates some counter incentives on the part of the Fed to do that kind of policy, because people will flee to other kinds of assets.
That's right. People flee because the value of euro, dollar, and other currencies going to the downside because they're printing money. And the smart people, they understand this, but the normal people not understand.
And that sort of market competition is something that I think will ultimately shore up our monetary policy and keep the dollar where it rightfully ought to be, which is as the dominant reserve currency it's been for all of our lives.
Yeah, it's very concerning to me that if we lose that position where our economy, our whole country, our way of life is at risk. Mr. Allaire, you made a comment in your testimony with regards to promoting the dollar as a primary currency. I assume you've got a thought on this as well.
That's an interesting point. What now coming?
Thank you, Congressman. Absolutely. I think, as I introduced in my initial remarks, we're at a really interesting moment in time. We're seeing this infrastructure layer, these blockchains, proliferate globally at incredible speed. It seems likely to us that the ability to access and interact with these blockchain networks will reach billions of users over the next 2 to 3 years.
The projection is what he make. There are a lot of interest of the people, and he said 3 billion people will use this. Yeah.
And the question is, in that time frame, will the United States support the dollar and digital dollars in the form
Digital dollar. Yeah. he says this question. Yeah. Will the U.S. government support us? Yeah. Other countries support the how can I say the industry of the cryptocurrencies, but the US is maybe not or will support.
of stablecoins, because they're in the market and operational today to help the United States dollar be the competitive currency of the internet. I think that's the opportunity. I think it's in front of us right now. And it's one of the reasons why we're so focused on this as a national economic, and not just a national economic priority, a national security priority, because clearly, if this is the new infrastructure, economic infrastructure of the internet.
He said this with his mouth. Yeah, he said this is the new infrastructure for the coming new economic system. Yeah,
Internet. We want the dollar to play a critical and strategic role, and
we want the dollar to play the key role here.
partnering closely with private companies and using open internet technologies becomes a way for the United States to compete versus states that are seeking to nationalize that infrastructure, operate it themselves in a surveillance-oriented model.
Well, it's interesting that you were talking a while ago, I think Ms. Velasquez asked questions about reserves, and I think you were talking about basically a one-to-one amount of backing of your coin.
Very important point. He talked about the treasuries, that is the coins are backed by the treasuries. Yeah.
Of your asset with U.S. Treasuries. So you're looking, I think, at the value of your that you're backing up your digital coin with is basically the full faith and trust of the United States government. Would that be correct?
That is exactly correct. And I think
Very interesting point that this stablecoin is backed by the U.S. Treasury.
you know, in many respects, the assets that back these dollar digital currencies are in many ways far safer than the dollars in a bank account, because dollars in a bank account, as we know, are fractionally
Very interesting also point that the dollars in the bank accounts are not safe. Yeah.
reserved and lent out. And so this is
I don't interrupt, but I got one quick question for Mr. Brooks with regards to, you talked about a minute ago with owner controls the network. We had Mr. Zuckerberg in here when he was trying to talk about his Libra. And the control of that, the value of it was going to be with a commission. My concern is who controls the internet.
Who controls the internet? Very important question.
Seen Twitter, we've seen Instagram, we've seen Facebook control people on their platforms. How concerned are you about outside forces controlling the platform on which the digital dollar is traded?
Well, Mr. Lukemeyer, I'll do you one better on your hypothetical, which is we've now seen major banks deplatforming both industries and individual customers for not sharing the right point of view. So these are scary ideas. The point of crypto is to have true decentralization, and the projects that succeed will be the projects that achieve that. Bitcoin succeeded because there are literally millions of participants in the node network, and so there is no CEO of Twitter to deplatform you, there's no CEO of JP Morgan to take away your credit card. It's user controlled. Some of these won't achieve that. They'll be consigned to the ash heap of history, I predict.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Colorado.
So my comment for this is, even if they make this decentral network, I think the governments will control this. The man, yeah, of the other side said, okay, the Facebook control the users, so they want the control mechanism. Yeah, so I don't think even if we have the decentral crypto surrounding and the technology, the governments want they will not want give the control to others. Yeah, they want the control. So I think even if you have the decentral network and crypto surrounding and ecosystem, I think the governments will want the control, and I think they could make something one layer more, yeah, and then they control the everything here. So I think that will come. So have a nice day. See you later.